All right, everybody, thank you so much for being here with us this evening for our very special Back to School Edition webinar, Navigating the Special Education Eligibility Process, specifically written for caregivers to give you a guide from referral to initial meeting. If you are in education, this is also a pretty helpful guide for you as well. So thank you all again for being here tonight. Tonight, our hope is that at the end of this webinar, you will know who can initiate an evaluation and how to do so. Know which disabilities are covered under federal law, what qualifies a student for special education and an IEP, know the timelines that schools are legally bound to, what an evaluation actually looks like, and what tests are commonly administered, who is at the team meetings, and who can caregivers bring to the meetings with them, and learn your very important role in these meetings and process. So I'm Michelle Farrell. I have a master's degree in education in moderate disabilities and special needs. I've been an educator for 2 decades, first at a private school for students on the autism spectrum, and I now currently work in a public school district that is a large and diverse city public school system. I've worked as a co-teacher in 8th grade full inclusion classrooms. I've also worked as a small group math interventionist. And for the past 8 years, I have been the special education team chairperson for grades K to 8, overseeing and helping to manage the inclusion and substantially separate programs, as well as the evaluation processes at my school. Equity, inclusion, and an emphasis on social justice and social emotional learning are main focal points for my work. And I'm excited to be here with Dana Marie, and I'm going to pass it on over to her.
Hi, everyone. I am Dana Marie. Like Michelle said, I also have a master's degree in moderate disabilities and special needs. My undergraduate work was in high school social studies, and most of my experience was as a high school teacher in history and English, as a co-teacher and in special education. But for the past 5 years, similarly to Michelle, I've been a team chairperson for special education, both at the K to 8 level and also at the 9 to 12 level, working with students ages 14 to 22. So I've experienced overseeing students at all levels, both in the inclusion setting and also in a substantially separate program for students with intellectual disabilities and autism. I'm currently engaged in my doctoral research around student voice, empowerment, and agency, and I like to bring that work into conversations about special education. So with all of that said, we are going to get started. We're going to overview a little bit, give a little bit of content, take a quick pause, see if there are any questions, finish up, and then at the end have some time for some questions and answers. Hi to everybody joining us after the live webinar. This will be posted later on our YouTube page and will be sent out to anyone who is registered for the webinar. So there might be some folks seeing this after tonight. We can take your questions, obviously, by email as well. So to get us started, this is sort of an overview of the process. So really the process starts with an initial eligibility with a referral, usually from a parent or a caregiver. However, the referral can come from a doctor or another professional or specialist. It can also come through the school team. Once the referral comes, if it comes from a parent, this consent form is then sent to the parent within 5 school days of receiving the referral. Once we receive the consent, or once the school receives the consent from the parent, then the school has 30 days to complete all of the evaluations necessary, and then 45 school days to hold a meeting with the parent and the school team to determine if the child is eligible for special education. If the team does determine that the child is eligible for special education within 10 days of that meeting, the parent is sent a draft copy of the individualized education plan, which they have 30 days to look over, to ask any questions about, to accept or reject any parts that they wish. So now we'll dive a little bit into all of those pieces of the timeline. So like I said, the first part of this eligibility process for an initial special education eligibility meeting is the referral. And like I mentioned, the student can be referred by a parent or caregiver, but the student can also be referred by another professional who has knowledge of the student and is concerned with the student's development. Oftentimes those letters come from pediatricians' offices or licensed clinical social workers, especially if the student has already been diagnosed with a disability. And under federal law, the school district must look for and identify and provide special education services for students with disabilities. And so it's in the best interest of both the school district, the school, and also obviously the parents and caregivers to work together to make sure that this process works, and that if the child has a disability, that we're making sure that we're meeting their needs. Often overlooked, the referral letter is actually one of the most important parts of the process. So if you are a parent or a caregiver and you're thinking about referring your child for a special education eligibility meeting, a lot of times this part, like I said, is overlooked, and people just send a letter that's one sentence or so saying, please test my child for special education. But it's really important to include as much information as possible in this letter because it really gets the ball rolling. So if you suspect that your child has a disability and you have a sense of what that might be, you can add that to the letter. If your child has already been diagnosed with a disability, maybe like I said, at the pediatrician's office, if they have an emotional disability, if they have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, let the school team know that up front because that will help them to determine which assessments feel appropriate and necessary to complete. Let the team know if your child has ever been evaluated. I think a lot of times we think about initial eligibility as being little kids, preschoolers and kindergartners, but we see it all the way up through high school. Parents and caregivers are referring children for special education. School teams are referring children for special education all the way up through their senior year and beyond. And so has the child ever been evaluated before? Maybe they weren't found eligible, but maybe things have changed since then. You want to let everyone know. And like I said, just be as specific as possible so that you can ensure that the appropriate assessments and evaluations are completed. Once you have written your letter, if you are the parent or caregiver or somebody on behalf of the parent or caregiver, you want to send the letter to the school. You can send it to the principal, you can send it to the district special education administrator, you can send it, if you know who that person is, to the team chairperson, the ETL, it's sometimes called an LEA in some schools. But you want to send that to somebody who can get the ball rolling. And then the school district will send you, like I said before, a consent form within 5 school days. And once you sign and return the consent form, the rest of the evaluation timeline kicks in. You can accept all of the evaluations they're proposing, some but not all. That part is totally up to you. One tip that we like to give the folks that we work with is that doing this in email gives you an automatic sort of timeline. It helps timestamp all of your communication with the school and with the district. And it kind of stops you from having to be like, wait, has it been 5 days? Has it been 30 days? Has it been 45 days? You can just go back into your email and see exactly when you sent the initial referral. And that can help you to kind of understand when the school is supposed to reach out to you. This is not an exhaustive list, depending on what the suspected disability is of your child, depending on what the school team has seen. There may very well be more or less assessments completed for the initial evaluation, but these are some of the more common seen ones. So the school team will, probably a school psychologist, conduct a psychological or cognitive assessment along with an academic achievement assessment that will look at math and reading and writing. If there are communication challenges or there's a suspected disability in the area of language, a speech and language evaluation. If there is suspected disability or challenges in the area of fine motor skills, gross motor skills, behavior, those are all reasons to include these additional assessments, an OT assessment, a PT assessment, etc. Oftentimes for an initial evaluation, the school and the district will also include a home assessment, and that's just to get some background information from the family about maybe challenges that the child had in the early years, if the child ever did early intervention, what sort of it was like, in the home growing up, if there were any challenges with the birth, anything like that. So this is a good idea and a good way to get additional information for the school team. And then this is the part that always sort of trips people up. Just because a child has a disability does not necessarily mean they will be eligible for special education. And this question is one that we have gotten often, and one of the reasons why Back to School felt like a good time to have this conversation, because it's not an automatic that just because a child has an identified disability that they will be getting special education services in school. School teams use a flow chart to determine if the child is eligible for special education and if they're eligible for an IEP. And of course, the first factor is whether or not the child has an identified disability. But then the next question that the school team will look at, and obviously you'll be part of that team, is whether the child is making effective progress in school. Because a child could very well have a disability, but they could also very well be making progress that is similar to their same age peers. And if that's the case, then they probably don't require special education services. If of course, they're not making effective progress, that's when we want to have this conversation. And then this team and you will determine if the lack of progress is due to their disability. So is their difficulty in making progress in school a result of whatever their disability is? And if you can answer yes to those first three questions, and the team will determine that your child requires specialized instruction and related services to access the general curriculum. And that's a whole lot of language and jargon. So later on, we'll get into a little bit what specialized instruction actually is or what related services actually are. But this is kind of just what would qualify a child for special education. And then finally, these are the federal disability categories that the school and the team will rely on to sort of answer that first question. So does your child have one or more, because it could be more than one, of these disabilities, or one or more of the disabilities within these categories? This is not an exhaustive list. For instance, we gave some examples in under emotional disabilities, under neurological disabilities, under health disabilities, but like I said, not an exhaustive list. There are other disabilities which obviously fall into these categories. And so that will be the first thing that the team determines based on all of the assessments and the evaluations that were completed. And that's already a lot of information, and more folks have joined us since the beginning. So in the comments, if you do have any questions so far that you want to make sure we answer at the end, or if there's one thing already that you can think of that you've maybe learned or didn't know before, please feel free to drop that in the comments. And for those of you who joined a couple of minutes late, at the end of this webinar, tomorrow you will receive the recording, but also a copy of the slides that were used today. So while you are welcome to write questions down or take notes and things like that, you'll have access to all of these slides for coming to the webinar tomorrow. But if there's anything right now that you want to make sure that we cover towards the end, or questions that you want us to answer, please feel free to either put them in the chat now or as we continue on.
Just going to pause a second in case there's anything in there. And Dana Marie, you can see the chat, correct?
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Oh, this is a great question, Michelle. One of our participants asked if every school uses the same flow chart.
Yep, so the flow chart might vary in different states, but under federal law, there are certain guidelines as outlined. The one that we showed is an example from Massachusetts, what we're required to use in Massachusetts schools to determine eligibility. That is an excellent question. So yes, every school should be using a flow chart that looks like that in the state of Massachusetts, and in other states, if you happen to be in another state, it might look a little different, but should have the same general questions on it. Okay.
I think that's all the questions for now, Michelle, if you wanna.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to dig into the meeting agenda. So your child has been referred for an evaluation. The evaluations have taken place, and now you should have received a meeting invitation to the meeting within at least 10 days before the meeting is going to take place. That is to give you ample time to be able to plan. And if that date and time does not work for you, to be able to reach out to the team and request a different date and time that works for all parties, okay? So you should receive that invitation, and it will also have a list of participants in the meeting, including yourself, and any of the evaluators, the general education teacher, and typically the special education teacher is invited in case the child is eligible. So if you're wondering, it's not always they're not here because they're not going to be eligible, or they're here because they are going to be eligible. Most likely they have been invited, okay? So at the meeting, there should be introductions. Everybody will introduce themselves, say who they are, what their role is, and what part of the evaluation they were involved in. The next part is a pretty important role for caregivers, and this is an opportunity for you to express your concerns for your child's development and progress in school. And if you referred your child for the evaluation, some of your reasons why you referred your child. And this is really your chance to have the stage and talk about your child and what you're worried about. It can be really helpful to have this concern statement or some bullet points listed out before you come into the meeting, so you're ready to go with it. You can also always send your statement to, if the child is eligible, to the team chairperson after the meeting, so they can pretty much just like copy and paste it into the IEP if they are eligible. The next part of the meeting is each evaluator will give a summary of their completed assessments. Then together as a team, you'll work through that flow chart to determine eligibility. If your child is eligible, the development of the IEP will happen there and then. And if not eligible, the team should then discuss other potential options for support if needed. So for example, if your child does have a disability, but it was determined that perhaps they don't need specialized instruction to make progress, but maybe some accommodations, a referral to the 504 eligibility team could be most appropriate at that time. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these other terminology as we go through here too, okay? But if there's anything you don't understand, feel free to drop it into the chat so we can make sure that we do answer it throughout this presentation. So what to bring with you to the meeting, and we already talked a little bit about this on the previous slide. So you want to be prepared with your parent concern statement ahead of time. And you also want to make sure that you request a copy of the evaluation reports from the team beforehand. And then you should then get those reports at least 48 hours before the meeting so that you have time to read through them and really just like kind of dig through, highlight them, mark them up, look for things like inaccuracies. Sometimes a birth date might be incorrect, a pronoun could be incorrect, things like that. And these are a part of your child's educational record. So we do want to make sure, and the team will be very grateful if you do find a typo or something like that in the reports, so we can make sure that they're very accurate. Also, go through and write down questions or things that you wonder about as you read through the evaluations, and don't worry or get nervous if you don't understand a lot of, or any of the jargon, the professional jargon that's written into these evaluations. If you are not an occupational therapist, you may not know what the word proprioception means, and nobody's expecting you to. But that's why it's really helpful for you to have those reports ahead of time so that you can mark them up and you can then highlight that word and say, can you explain to me what this is at the meeting? So you fully understand what the evaluator has summarized about your child in that area and their recommendations. Just like before, when you put in the referral, if you have any input from outside service providers, so if you have documentation of any diagnoses, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, anything like that, if your child happens to receive speech services outside of school, anything like that from service providers outside of the school is really useful information for the team to use. You might also want to come prepared with that year and maybe the previous year's report cards, progress reports, any previous evaluations like Dana Marie had mentioned earlier. Although this is an initial evaluation, your child may have been evaluated a couple of years beforehand or when they were younger. So all of that information can be very, very useful to share with the team, especially the evaluators before testing and the meeting. Important note, if you are also pursuing like a neuropsychological evaluation through your primary care physician or through your pediatrician outside of the school, if there is another evaluation happening outside the school, please, please, please let the school know so that there can be a communication between the speech and language evaluator at the school and the speech and language evaluator outside, because if they replicate the same tests, it can invalidate that testing. So we want to make sure that if there's any testing that's happening kind of at the same time, that all evaluators are aware of that to make sure that the same tests are not utilized. And then the last thing to make sure you bring with you to the meeting is a notebook and or folder. You'll probably be getting lots of handouts and things that you're going to want to take home with you and keep track of. You're going to want to take notes. And an important note is, in Massachusetts, you cannot record a meeting, especially without letting everybody know that that is happening. And it's not very common practice for a meeting to be recorded. So paper and pencil or typing on your iPad or whatever are the best way for you to make notes. Please don't expect to go into a meeting and be able to hit record on your phone, especially without telling folks. Okay, so now you're at the meeting, you've gone through everything, you've had a conversation, and you have determined eligibility. What happens next? If your child is eligible, the team is now going to work together at this meeting to develop a draft of a proposed individualized education plan, the IEP, for your child with specialized instruction and or services. The plan will include modifications, accommodations, goal areas for your child to work on, and services to support them reaching those goals in the IEP year. You will receive a meeting summary at the end of this meeting, and then you will get the proposed IEP within 10 school days for your review. You will then have 30 calendar days to review and respond to the proposed document. And just know that, especially as an initial IEP, none of the services, modifications, accommodations, especially pull out of the general education classroom, none of that can happen without you accepting and signing those services and plan. So it is really important that you do respond to this plan in that 30 days so that your child can get those services that the team has determined that they are eligible for. This does not mean that you need to accept the entire IEP. You have the right to partially reject any of the services or goal areas, or fully reject the IEP as well. Some common things that might be partially rejected is sometimes IEPs are partially rejected. The IEP is actually accepted in full, but partially rejected for insufficiency. So if you, as a caregiver, believe that your child requires more of the services or more goals or more accommodations, more modifications, and there's like more than just like one area that you're disputing, that's a really good way to make sure that at least what is proposed is able to get started while you come back together as a team to kind of discuss what those insufficiencies from your point of view are. And then after you have a fully accepted IEP, this will be reviewed at least annually together as a team. And then a reevaluation is held every 3 years to redetermine eligibility. And there are ways, if the team is struggling to come to a consensus, if there are parts of the IEP that the team is not in full agreement with, and you continue with a partially rejected IEP, there are other routes to mediate and come to a decision about that. But that is more deep than what this webinar is going into. So if anybody has any specific questions about that, please reach out to us so that we can support you in that. Now, what if your child is not eligible? One, if your child has a disability but does not require specialized instruction, they may require accommodations to help them access the general curriculum. So then the team should then refer the child to a 504 to eligibility team to see if they're eligible for a 504 accommodation plan. If they do not have a disability, but they're still struggling to make progress. So for instance, over the past 3 school years, most of our students have not had a quote unquote typical school year without lots of interruptions and disruptions to their learning. So they might not have a disability, but might be below grade level in some areas, right? And in this case, you're going to want to inquire with the school team about what other interventions are available for all students outside of special education to help them close some of those gaps that they might be having. So you might be wondering, with all of this talk about accommodations versus specialized instruction. So these are a few examples of what accommodations are and what specialized instruction is. So specialized instruction, so first of all, let's back up a second. Related services would be if your child needs speech and language therapy, if they need occupational therapy, if they require a positive behavior support plan that is then going to receive consultation with the board certified behavior analyst, okay? Those are related services. And if your child then requires different reading curriculum like Wilson reading or Orton Gillingham reading to help them learn to decode, or read naturally to help support their fluency, that would be a form of specialized instruction. Touch math would be a way of teaching students kinesthetically how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. This would be then provided by services with the special education teacher. Discrete trials are often used for students who are receiving supports with applied behavioral analysis. Child might require specialized instruction for social pragmatics or social learning and making friends, right? They might require support with executive functioning, how to navigate with study skills and task management and organization. Specialized instruction can also include something like an allowance to demonstrate mastery of content in a variety of ways. So for instance, in a science class, a student might be allowed to do a presentation or tell the answers to the teacher about the unit verbally, as opposed to taking a written test. Now, any of these things would then fall under specialized instruction, which would then be written into an IEP. Examples of accommodations for which a student might need in order to fully access the curriculum due to their disability, making it more difficult for them to do so. Examples might be making sure they have a stand-up desk to work at, or they're allowed to move around or sit on a ball while they're working, right? Extra time on timed assessments, separate location for assessments, small group for instruction or assessments, the use of fidgets in class, allowing the use of a backpack to carry their materials in middle school and high school, if that's not something that's typically allowed in that particular school. Allowing the student to use a computer-based organization and or agenda system instead of having to carry around multiple binders or agenda books that they're constantly losing. I think we all know some kiddos and some friends who maybe a computer-based organization system might be really helpful for. So that would be kind of the difference of what you would see on an IEP versus something like a 504 plan. And I do want to take just a moment to note that a 504 plan is not like a consolation prize, like, oh, your kid didn't qualify for an IEP, here's a 504 plan. A 504 plan is covered under federal law, under the civil rights. It's a civil rights violation for folks to not follow a 504 plan for a student or an adult. A 504 plan is often carried out also in places like colleges and workplaces. So Section 504 is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it is a legally binding, super important plan that needs to be followed by folks in the school. So just a little tangent on that. So what if you've gone through all of this and you don't agree with the school about the determination of eligibility or a part of the proposed IEP? So first, and this is another thing that we could probably do an entire webinar on, but we're just going to make it known that you have the right to request an independent evaluation. So under Mass law, upon receipt of evaluation results, if a parent disagrees with an initial evaluation or reevaluation completed by the school district, then the parent may request an independent education evaluation. So if at the meeting you go through the flow chart, the team chairperson or whoever is facilitating the meeting is going to say, are you satisfied with this evaluation? If you are not satisfied with the evaluation, you're going to circle no. And then that person facilitating the meeting will then go right into the parent rights brochure with you to this section of how you are going to go and follow through with requesting an independent evaluation, okay? So if that happens at a meeting, that's all there for you. And that person who's facilitating the meeting should walk you through that step. Now, we had mentioned this earlier. If, let's say you accept the evaluation, everything's great, you're happy they are eligible now, they're gonna get the services that they need to be successful in school, but maybe the speech language pathologist proposes one session of 30 minutes of speech a week, and you feel pretty strongly that they need 2 sessions of 30 minutes of speech each week. This is in a case where instead of just kind of going back and forth at the meeting, let the school district make that proposal. And this would be a really good place where you can do a partial rejection. This can also work for a placement. So when you're developing the IEP, you are also, based on how many services the student requires and where those services are taking place in the classroom or outside of the general education classroom, is going to help the team determine if your child is going to have a full inclusion, partial inclusion, or a substantially separate placement. It is very, very rare for a student to, quite honestly, even end up with a substantially separate placement from that initial meeting, because it is always the goal of the team, of the school district, and under law to provide services to a child in the least restrictive environment, try it in inclusion, and then follow kind of the chain to see where they can then make the best progress. So it is very, very rare. There are, you may have heard of out of district schools. It's very rare for a student to go from an initial evaluation to no longer being placed in the school. But if you have any deeper questions about that, we can talk about it in a few minutes. I'm going to turn it back over to Dana Marie.
And so in summary, you know, this process can be really tricky. It can be convoluted. It can be really confusing for parents and caregivers. Michelle and I have worked with parents who are themselves teachers and have their own children with disabilities in other schools or in other districts. And even for folks who are working in schools, it can be a really tricky process. And so there are some things that if you keep just these few things in mind, you're off to the right start in helping your child sort of go through this process. I think the number one important part is you have rights as a parent or caregiver. You have a right to request the eligibility meeting. You have the right to be involved, like we said, in the entire process, to share your concerns. You have the right to make sure that everyone is adhering to the timeline. The timeline is not like a nice to do timeline. It's a timeline that the school district absolutely needs to follow. And so while it can sometimes feel uncomfortable for some people, you can follow up, like I said, with email if they've not sent you a consent form within 5 days of your requesting it. You can follow up if they've not completed the evaluations within the 30 days they let you know they were going to. You can follow up if you've not received the evaluations 48 hours before the meeting. So I think that's really important, and one thing that we like to stress with our clients, there's a way that you can do that, and it can feel uncomfortable, but that's your right as a parent to make sure that the process is going the way that it's supposed to be going. Remember that in order for a child to be eligible for special education, they must have a disability and must not be making effective progress in school as a result of the disability. And then finally, and this was sort of mentioned briefly, but I want to highlight that as the parent or caregiver, you should never be asked to agree to services, accommodations, etc. at the eligibility meeting. Like Michelle said, you can have the 30 days following the proposed IEP to take a look at it to see if you accept everything, if there are some things that you don't want to accept, but you have time to take a moment, take a step back, and either with somebody else in your family, or if you've hired somebody to help you, to take a look at all the parts of an IEP, which can be a long document, and make sure that you're just not agreeing to it on the spot. And so if they're asking you to do that at the meeting, you can say, I'd actually like to see the proposed IEP and take my time to look through it before signing anything. So those are kind of our 4 key takeaways of things as a parent you have the right to do and to ask for, and making sure that the process is going the way that is supposed to be going. And with that said, we have a couple of questions. We have some great questions, and I'm just going to start with the questions that came in first. Oh, great question. Do schools typically list their specialized strategies anywhere, like a menu of options that parents can see? Fantastic question. I'll take this first one. This can be tricky for sure. For children not in special education, most school districts do have a list of sort of interventions. We call them tiered interventions that you use before a child is eligible for special education. And that's for your non-special education, your general education students. The school and the district should have a list of those tiered interventions that are available to all students, regardless of whether they are in special education or not in special education. I think that one thing, and this is another rabbit hole that we could go down but don't have the time to do tonight, one thing that can be tricky and confusing, that even within the same school district, some schools might have different interventions. They might offer different specialized instruction. They might offer different services. And so once again, it is your right as a parent to ask these questions, like what other reading interventions are available? And if Wilson reading is proposed for your child with a reading disability. You can say, what other reading interventions are available for my child with a learning disability in reading? And if they don't have an answer to that, that's a different conversation. But like I said, it's your right as a parent to make sure that those questions are being considered and answered.
I do think that kind of leads into like with placements. So sometimes it'll happen, different schools in the district will host or hold different programs that support students that need more services in order to access the content than what they would be getting in a full inclusion, and I mean, placement can also be the partial inclusion. And in that case, the school district, they can't, if that's the placement where your child is going to be the most successful, your child might have to change schools in order to attend to that placement. The school district does not have to create a program at the school where your child is at, if that program exists already in the district. So.
Another good question, how often do you have to review the IEP? So in general, the IEP is reviewed every year annually, on or around the same date. And like Michelle said earlier, a reevaluation completed every 3 years, and that's with new evaluations, new assessments, and to redetermine eligibility. All of that said, as a parent or caregiver, you can request a meeting with your child's school team, with your child's special education team, and the school and district does have to, not immediately, but within a certain timeline, respond to you to set up that meeting. So if you're 6 months into an IEP and you realize like, these goals no longer make sense for my child, or I thought, like Michelle said, 1 time a week for speech was going to be enough, but I've seen no progress in terms of my child's communication skills or language skills, you can always request another meeting to get the team back together to review data, to see what progress has been made. A good time to do that always is around progress report time. And so when the school team sends home your child's IEP goal progress reports, and if you notice anything, maybe they're not making progress, or maybe they're not making effective progress, like we said, that might be a good time to get in touch with the school and say, hey, let's reconvene the team. I know it's not time for a full annual review meeting or a full reevaluation, but there are obviously things that we need to talk about and maybe fix. And it can be changed. Some schools and districts can be hesitant in the middle of an annual cycle to do that, but it can always be updated. It can always be adapted and changed if it's not meeting the needs of your child. Mm-hmm. And Michelle, if you want to grab this question, is effective progress just based on grades?
Nope. So effective progress, depending on what your child's disability is, they will have specific goals in the areas that they are having challenges in related to their disability, for which they will then get quarterly progress reports, like Dana Marie just mentioned, saying what their progress is on those goal areas. So effective progress, one of the best ways is through data collection by either the service provider or the special education teacher, through those progress reports to make note if they are progressing with their IEP goals. And if they are progressing with their IEP goals, we could then say that they are making effective progress. There is some nuance and there is a lot of subjectivity in the terminology effective progress. However, all of the IEP goals should be data-driven with something that is able to be measured. And then the progress reports should then be data-driven with data to show progress or not to those goals and objectives. And sometimes a student's progress is going to be effective progress, even if it seems really, really, really slow to us. And that just might be part of their learning profile and who they are as learners. So sometimes it can be really challenging because we think as the adults who love and care about these children, that they are going to get this IEP and everything, they're just going to catch right up and everything's going to be fine. And then in 3 years, they won't need an IEP anymore. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And it really depends on the child and their unique needs, and then that's why effective progress can be so nuanced for a child. But no, grades are not the only way that would be measured. Excellent question.
And there are no other questions in the chat. We are going to wrap up in a few minutes. So if you do have a last question, throw it in there. When we send out the recording, along with the slides, there will be an opportunity to complete a super quick, very simple form with a little bit of feedback from tonight's webinar. And in there, you'll be able to let us know if you have any questions that you want to chat about further, or if there are any topics that you want to see us covered further. So with that said, we are empowered to advocate. Michelle and I are so grateful that you joined us, and to those who we're going to send the recording to later who weren't able to join us tonight. We're glad that you joined us as well. You can find us pretty much everywhere these days. We're on Instagram, we're on Pinterest. You can join our website. You can join our newsletter. We're on LinkedIn. This webinar will be up on our YouTube page within the next couple of days. So feel free to reach out to us, send our information to anyone that you think could possibly use the support. We will let you all know when we have our next webinar and what our next topic will be, and please feel free to share it with your networks. We have some references at the end, some of the laws in particular that we talked about today that can be very nuanced. We did drop some links to those local and federal laws at the end of the presentation. So if you have more questions about that, you'll see that when you get the slides in the next day or so. But with all of that said, we thank you for those of us who were able to be here live, but like I said, those who will be watching the recording later on as well. We appreciate you joining us and look forward to a new school year starting oh so soon for many folks.
Yay. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Couple other questions that just came through in the chat. I can just see that there, or are they?
Oh, I think it was just a great job. Well done, informative.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. And again, please reach out with any more personalized questions. We do offer a complimentary 20-minute consult that you can schedule with us to help, figure out maybe that one question with you, or if we can be any help in any other way. So thank you again for being here. We so very much appreciate you.